faith. Good morning. Welcome to a discussion among LGBTQ leaders about faith and social justice, an event fueled by the religious movement for LGBTQ equality. My name is Eric Peters. Let's open with prayer. Father, all-powerful and ever-living God, in the universe you created, perhaps by setting up the Big Bang and designing evolution, you placed a moral arc that bends toward justice. May your kingdom come and bring with it the social justice central to your reign. May our sharing about your all-inclusive love, all-inclusive regardless of race, sex, disability, class, creed, sexual orientation, and gender identity, find open hearts with good soil, no rocks, no thorns. Embolden us by your blessed Holy Spirit, the spirit of prophecy, to speak truth to intersecting systems of power, hate, exclusion, and violence. In the name of all that which is holy, amen. Let's briefly acknowledge people who made this event possible. This gathering was first conceptualized as a way to express appreciation and gratitude to the 34 churches who raised over $8,500 to place advertising with a powerful LGBTQ affirming message at Christmas and Easter time. Reverend Carl Stevens from St. Stephen's Episcopal Church provided pastoral support that enabled my work. Danielle Boyd, with a Master's of Science in Social Administration, the executive coordinator at Stonewall Columbus, did amazing things with the computers to bring us together. Bottom line, Stonewall Columbus promised and Stonewall Columbus delivered. By the way, they have some really exciting events on their calendar at stonewallcolumbus.org. I've invited 5 speakers to take about 8 to 10 minutes each to address 3 questions. 1, how has your personal religious or spiritual faith inspired and shaped your social justice work? 2, what have you experienced related to interdenominational and interfaith social justice work addressing racial and LGBTQ equality? 3, what do you hope happens related to such interdenominational and interfaith work, or to share with us as their hearts move them? Our first speaker, who has generously agreed to act as moderator from this point on, thank you, Karen, is Karen Hewitt. Nick Hewitt, with a Master's in Education, acts as the Deputy Director of Kaleidoscope, an improv comedian and poet-singer, an artist, a writer, a musician, a drummer, a 2020 recipient of the Create Columbus Visionary Award, a 2021 cohort poet in Scott Wood's Rhapsody and Refrain, an ensemble member in Counter Madison's Aretha Franklin tribute, which sold out the Lincoln Theater, the renowned Lincoln Theater, in February 2020. She's a leader, a published author, a recovering Pentecostal preacher's kid, and affiliated with Reconciling Methodist now, has attended Summit on 16th and Short North Church, and identifies as a believer in Christ. Karen, thank you so much.
Thank you, Eric, and everyone you mentioned for getting us all together. I am so excited to talk with this fantastic group of people. So with that, I am going to introduce everyone, and I will take a moment after I talk about your fantastic bios and see if you want to add anything quickly about your experience. I know this is uncomfortable for me to hear all those things, so but absolutely afterwards, if you would like to add anything to what I'm saying about you, please, I'm going to give you a moment to do so. And I first want to start with Erica Carter. She, her pronouns, has an MBA, so I always want to put that in there. Congratulations on that. Trans woman of color, former TransOhio board member, past regional assistant of TransSaints and trans and queer people of color, a native of Michigan, currently residing in the Cleveland area, a freelance photographer and curator of a traveling photo exhibit, the Black Trans Project, plans to self-publish a personal memoir, and you can go to erica.com, that's ARYKAH.com, to see kind of the cover and get really excited about that book, which I'm very excited about. And then member of a South Euclid United Church of Christ and worships regularly with other groups, and Chicago Theological Seminary seminarian. Erica, do you have anything to add for that? That is a fantastic bio. Okay, well, we're so glad to have you today. I can't wait to hear what you have to say. Our next guest is Aaron Eckert, uses they, them, theirs pronouns, has an MSW, is the executive director of the Buckeye Region Anti-Violence Organization known as Bravo, which addresses hate crimes and intimate partner violence, and an adjunct instructor at Capital University. Aaron, anything to add?
No, not really. Other than I'll just update my title. It's just director.
Okay. All right.
We dropped the other word.
All right, fair. I'm sure there's some power dynamics and interesting stories in there, but we'll get to that soon.
Fine.
All right.
Good.
All right, our next participant is Jacob Nash, using he, him, his pronouns with the MA and CDP. Former TransOhio board member, Case Western Reserve University adjunct professor, co-owner of Nash Integrated Services LLC, an independent diversity trainer and consultant, support team member facilitator at Compass Consulting Services LLC, a former fellow of the National LGBTQ Task Force, former trans and faith delegate to Soul Force, current team member for Margie's Closet, a new trans store in Lakewood, and co-founder and board president of Margie's Hope, a social service agency housed in Akron UCC Church for trans people. Jacob, do you have anything to add to that?
No. Too much already. But
no doubt. Thank you for being here, and we're looking forward to this conversation. And last but definitely not least, we have Reverend Luther Young Jr., he, him, his, Master's of Divinity, Ph.D. candidate in the sociology department at The Ohio State University, now doing dissertation research focused on Black churches and LGBTQ communities, former community chair of Vanderbilt University Black Seminarians, former Pentecostal, cheers to that, featured author in Growing in God's Love, a Story Bible, current minister of music and creative arts at Woodland Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, and moderator of the Disciples LGBTQ+ Alliance of the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ. Luther lives in Columbus with his husband. And I know Luther is already on Eric's docket to come speak at church soon. So building communication and building relationships is definitely something that this panel is sure to do. Luther, do you have anything else you would like to add to that?
No, thank you all for having me.
Great. Well, the first question I want to ask, and we are going to stick pretty closely to those questions that we have that Eric has brought to us and mentioned. But the first question I do want to ask, and this can be for anybody and everyone, how did you reconcile religion, spirituality, and your LGBTQ+ identities? So I want to offer that question to start. And how did you get here religiously and spiritually to where we are? Because there's a lot of involvement in the church and religion here.
well, I will jump right in. Sorry about that. Those are my dogs. Just as I click to come on, of course, that happens. So for me, I knew that as a transgender person, I transitioned 23 years ago now. And back then, the conversation about trans individuals wasn't even really there, let alone about trans men. So for me, it was never about whether I left the church or not, because for me, it really wasn't about church as much as it was about a relationship with God. But I also immediately, when came to the realization of who I was like, okay, well, what does the Bible say about that? Of course, transgender is not a word in the Bible. But of course, I looked up eunuchs, I looked up all of these other words that were associated. And actually, one day after I had done my Bible study in the morning, I was reading about Jacob wrestling with the angel of God and saying, I just want you to bless me. I just want you to bless me. So after I was done, I was taking a walk out to the mailbox. And I was having that one-on-one conversation with God, saying, you know what, Lord, I don't want to do anything to hurt you. I love you. You are the most important relationship in my life. Please, I said what most everybody that I know has said at one point or another, show me a sign. I said, yes, Lord, I know. I don't know how many times you hear that, but please, I need to know something that this is okay with you, who I am, because I love you and I want to serve you, but I also want you to bless me. So as I got down to the mailbox, I opened the mail, and literally in the mail was a letter from my doctor stating that I was male, I should be treated as male, I should be, use the pronouns male and everything. And I was like, that was, God's timing is always perfect. And from then on, I knew that, God loved me and created me exactly the way that I am. And that has absolutely influenced the work that I do within my community, because he calls us to serve all people. He calls us to, clothe those that need clothing, to feed those that need feeding. And clothing and feeding is what we do, what we're supposed to do in loving one another. And so I truly would not be here today if it were not for my relationship with God.
Thank you for sharing that, Jacob. Anybody else want to pick up there?
I think I'll go next. So the question was, how did I reconcile my LGBTQIA plus identity and my faith, essentially? And that is a ongoing an ongoing task, for me. It seems like every day I have a new thought, a new ideal. I as I get more into studying the Bible and reading the Bible, and trying to increase and strengthen my relationship with God, I have a hard time believing a lot of the stuff that I was taught growing up. Growing up in a Black Baptist church, often the things that you learned were things that someone told you, and not necessarily things that were scripturally based, or if they were scripturally based, they were wrong. In the context, people have a tendency to take one verse and, run with it. And that one verse, if you don't read, 20 verses before and 20 verses after, or sometimes even more than that, then you lose the entire context of what's being said. And so, I have a hard time believing that, a God that I love and serve is going to send me to fire and brimstone because of who I am. When I can look around plenty of churches and many of churches and see clergy that are doing things that are wrong. So for me, it's hard to believe that, and I had to kind of reconcile using my logic. And my logic is that the God that I serve is not one that's going to cast me into a pit of fire and brimstone because I'm transgender, or because I love someone of the same sex, or whatever it may be. So it's an ongoing process. It's not something that I just woke up one morning and the light switch clicked and that was it. It's one of those things where um, I think someone used a term with you earlier. I think it was Eric used the term with um, the moderator, where it was a recovering Pentecostal. So I guess I'm a recovering Baptist to some degree. And I go to my meetings, weekly, and I talk with God about being in recovery and how to turn that corner. So it's an ongoing process. It's not one that, happens overnight. And that's where I'm at right now.
Thanks for sharing that. For me, that's very similar. I grew up Nazarene and Lutheran, which is an interesting combination, but both from multiple sides of the family, and was really close with religion for a long time as a young person, and identified very strongly with religion, and was walking that path towards being a religious leader of some sort. And then my life changed. And so when I learned who I was and church in
Like
many
Aaron
ways.
froze us a little bit, but
Oh.
they're back. Okay, they're back.
Sorry, I might be having some internet issues, but I was just saying that I was pretty deeply wounded for a long time around religion. I had been asked to, or told, or made to leave churches and the church in general with a capital C. And so how it has shaped my work, or how I've reconciled, I'm still am. And so it's still a journey. I have good days and bad days. And so I spent many years just running away, to be honest, and not paying attention. And that stopped working for in a lot of ways, in a lot of weird ways, sideways ways. And so, I'm still on this journey, but finding my way, finding people that help me find my way. And so embracing my spirituality and faith more than my religion at this moment in my life. And so exploring those deeply. And I think the connections to service, to assistance, to being with community. Something that I heard a long time ago is, to be welcoming, you have to be welcomed, which means you have to be with community and with people and sit. And the callings that I had as a young person in that are deeply rooted in faith. And so that's what I focus on a lot.
Thanks for sharing that. Reverend Young, did you have anything?
Yeah, I want to share a quick story. I resonate with what folks have said already, and a lot of that aligns with my own personal journey. One of the things that I struggled with, and honestly still struggle with sometimes, is reconciling, my calling as a clergy person with being a member of the LGBTQ plus community. And this became particularly salient a few years ago when I came out. I put that in quotes because it wasn't a secret, but some people were unclear. So I just decided to clarify. It's like, hey, this is what it is. And I was serving a congregation at the time. I know my bio mentioned that I grew up Pentecostal, and I am still very Pentecostal down in my soul. But at this time, I was serving a Baptist church. I was on staff there. And when I came out, there was some contention and some back and forth. And ultimately, we came to this conclusion that this congregation was not ready to have an openly gay minister on staff. And that was hurtful. There were lots of hurtful things that were said, lots of hurtful things that were done that I won't go into in this particular call. So I was hurt and confused. And I told God, I said, why? I asked God, why are you calling me to something when the people don't want me here? Why should I even stay? Like, what is this? And so I decided to stop by a church. There was a Seventh-day Adventist church in town because this was on like a Friday. I was like, I need something. So I stopped by this church on a Saturday, and I knew some people there, but I kind of sat in the back corner because I didn't want to be bothered. I didn't feel like talking to anybody. I was trying to avoid the cameras, all the broadcast. I didn't want to be seen. I just wanted to come in and hear. And at one point, this woman got up and told a story about a plant she received when she was in undergrad, like 20 years or something prior. And she said this plant was really special to her because it was given to her by a custodial worker at the school who had kind of looked out for her and served as like a second father for her when she was away from home for the first time. And she kept this plant all these years. Well, the previous winter, she had some work done on her home, and the worker set her plants outside. It can get pretty chilly in Nashville where I was living at the time. And so they killed her plant. And she was so, devastated and heartbroken. And so months went by and the plant's dead. And she, keeps thinking to herself every time she sees it, oh, I need to throw that out. I need to throw that out. It's gone. It's useless. I need to throw this plant out. And she never gets around to it somehow. And so the months go by, spring comes, weather warms up, and she looks at the plant and notices that it's starting to pick up a little bit more. And she says, oh, wait, So she takes the plant, she repots it, gives it some new soil, nourishes it, waters it, tends to it, cultivates it, cares for it. And she said in that story that now that plant has grown and it has blossomed 2 to 3 times more than it had ever blossomed before. And she ended her story by saying that, God is like that sometimes. When people will seek to discard you, when people find that you are no longer worthy, that you're useless, they think that you're just dead to them, that God will take you and care for you and water you and nurture you and cultivate you. And I sat at the back of that church and boo-hoo cried uncontrollably. I was inconsolable because that was the answer that I needed, right? So that when other people had discarded me and other people do discard me and will discard me, this is something that will happen. I trust and have faith that God will be there to cultivate me and nourish me. And God will place people in my life who will do that for me. And God has done that for me.
Well,
Appropriate. Yes. Wow, that was powerful. And I'm just sitting here thinking about all the stories. I say recovering Pentecostal lightly and jokingly, and it's a real thing. I think at times I felt like religion has given people the ability to act as God. And I always felt like that was a human need for power. If we age it back to the story of Lucifer, there's a need for power, and it's within us. And I think, I think about how I would go into church and express myself, and I would always have shorts on under my skirt, and I would always be playing basketball or football in between choir practice and or choir rehearsal and Bible study. I was always out there being pretty fluid, which I identify as now. But then, when I started to go away to college and I had some freedom to kind of explore what that looked like, I was going to a Catholic college. I'd seem not to be able to get away from it, which is fine. And it was indeed a denim skirt or like a skirt, you know what I'm saying? Anyway, we were up at Zanesville at church camps, and we had rapture drills, which are terrifying and slightly traumatic. But when I think about all of those things and like being who I was, the notion that I was a great student, that I was, on the Bible Bowl team, or that I was, not drinking Coca-Cola because it was too strong, like the notion of all those things, and that I was still going to hell. During Halloween, we went to church and watched You've Been Left Behind. And I don't know if anybody's seen that series, but that's slightly traumatic as well. So I would go to sleep, and the first girlfriend I ever had, I would go to sleep holding her, sleep, like crying. And I would be like, God's going to judge me, God's going to do all this. And And then, you know, it was like my parents, are you proud of me? And, oh, you'd be proud of me if it weren't for that one thing that you were, you know, gay or lesbian or whatever they called it or understood about it at the time. And then when it became I'm non-gender conforming and gender fluid and pan, like all those identities that I was grappling with literally in my 30s, because I didn't feel like I had permission to do that up until then. My dad was the minister, and we do work together in diversity management to this day, but he also worked for the city in terms of community relations commission. So he was like, I want to love my daughter. Like he was always asking about that. And then was like, I have a trans daughter. And like, so he was understanding what the umbrella looks like and is still understanding what that umbrella looks like. And he was the first person that I felt like, you know, my mom told me that I was, you know, in bondage and that I needed, you know, relief and probably exorcism at some point. But, you know, my father was the first person to say, you know, am I the reason why you were like that? Which I was like, no, I love men. Like, it was like, no, that's not it. But it was me really understanding who I was, giving myself permission to be able to understand that. And then really like when I went to, the first time I went to a United Methodist Church, Reconciling Church, Summit on 16th, they invited me there because I moved to Columbus and I had pretty much taken a time away. I would go to the Catholic services and I loved the homilies and I was like, okay, cool. Like, and then I might go watch like the L Word. If it was on a Sunday, L Words was on Sunday. So like, you know, there was some conflict there internally, but I got to a place here and they were like, would you come do a drag show at a Reconciling Ministries conference? And I was like my mind just blew up and I was like, wait a minute, what? And so Lester Singleton was the first person to ever like show me, like they had a drag king and a drag queen. And so I was like, wait, I could be gender fluid in my performance and persona too. And God still loves me. And we're going to talk about scripture that shows that God loves me and not just throw homophobic scripture at me out of context without an exegesis or any understanding of it. And it was the first time that I felt like I didn't have to defend myself. And so I became a member there, was on the worship team, HR committee. And then I also at the Short North Church, they were starting. And so I started worshiping and being on the worship team over there. And I still, you know, I believe when I walk outside in nature or doing that, like that's church, I believe Jesus is there. I remember sitting back in church and thinking, this is not what Jesus meant, you know? And I was just like, I just kept believing that when I was 8 to 14, I was like, I don't think this is what Jesus meant. Like, this isn't the beloved community. I believe there's something different available for us. And you know, the more stories I looked into and the more I understood about Jesus spending time with the lepers and the eunuchs and the whores and those being his chosen people, I was like, there's something we're not interpreting right. And like, I don't understand it. And so the next question I'm going to pose leading right into that is in terms of social justice. I know right now, racial justice and social justice are big topics. The church has had some issues in terms of how to stand up, how to say it, recognizing, you know, people will say that this is a religion that endorsed or encouraged slavery. So like, how does your religion look in terms of social justice and how you move about the world in a time such as this with a lot of social justice conversations and racial justice conversations? That's for everybody. So take it as you will.
I'll go first. To be quite honest with you, I started attending a church in Cincinnati, Ohio, about 8 years ago, I guess. The church is Truth and Destiny Covenant Ministries in College Hill. The pastor is Leslie Jones. And up until that point, I had no clue that, you know, social justice and religion kind of went hand in hand, because that had not been what I was taught in church when I went to church. That pastor was very involved in the community, very involved in I mean, in everything in the community. While she identifies as a lesbian pastor, she was passionate and compassionate about people and helping people. She ran for city council once. She may run again. I don't know. But I had no clue until I met her that, you know, justice is a Jesus thing, as the T-shirts say. And and it was there that I gained an even greater love for God, or for Jesus in my case. But um, they go hand in hand, and I just never really realized it until having that exposure. So that's where, for me, I found it at, and that's just been in the last 8 years. And if I'm really, really honest, it's probably even been probably just in the last 4 or 5 that I've really started to reconcile those two things and see the intersectionality there.
Thank you, Erica. I'm from Cincinnati, so I was like, where'd you go? But that's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. Anyone else want to talk about it? And I would encourage anybody to just process out loud. We have a little bit of time. We only have a few questions. So if it's just thoughts running in your mind, please feel free to process it out loud here with us. I appreciate it.
I had somewhat of a similar experience. You know, church growing up, you would hear sermons about justice, maybe. We would talk about justice, but actually doing the work of justice, somewhat maybe, but not necessarily. But it wasn't until I connected with the congregation when I lived in Nashville. New Covenant Christian Church will always be my church, no matter where I am. And their model of church, like it blew my mind. For them, justice was the center. Everything else was auxiliary. And so even, you know, not only was the church very much involved in all sorts of community service and activism. One of the things that we commonly did was this community day that we hold every year, where a member of the church is a judge. And so she would team together with other judge, and they would hold expungement clinics and expunge people's records. And so folks could, you know, have their records cleared, and now they're eligible for employment. So then you could leave the expungement clinic, walk across the way to the fellowship hall. There's a job fair with hiring managers there ready to hire you on the spot. Okay, now you have a job. Well, if you go outside, there's a clothing closet. Now you have clothes for your first day of work. There was free food. We would have mobile trucks outside where folks can get HIV tests and all sorts of health screenings. We'd have people there to do dental cleanings for free for people who maybe perhaps didn't have insurance. They can get those things. There would be, you know, it was just this myriad of things there in the church, at the church. And not only that, it was nothing for these things to happen on a Sunday morning, right? So, you know, we would come to church and the entire kind of pulpit or stage area would be rearranged, and we would be having a forum or a panel. There wouldn't be a sermon that day. There would be a discussion about voting rights. We would be getting people registered to vote. It was not uncommon, like periodically, you know, throughout the year, we would have HIV testing during the service. You know, the pastor would get up and say, hey, at any point during the service, you can just, you know, step on out here. They can get you your tests done. We would do all sorts of health screenings. You know, it was just that type. There were some Sundays we didn't have service at all, where we would come to the church, we would meet up, and then we would go out into the community and say, okay, well, there are some elder folks down the street that need their house painted. So some people are going to go do that. Some people are going to go down here and clean up the highways. And then if you're perhaps maybe not as mobile, or if that doesn't interest you, some people are going to stay here at the church, and we're going to write letters to our elected officials, right? And that was church for that day. And so I loved that, right? Like that such that justice was the model of ministry. And that aligns with my understanding of scripture too. So coming through seminary and learning that a lot of the scriptural passages, if we look closely at the heart of them, is a concern for the oppressed and demonstrates God's constant concern for justice. Even a lot of the scriptures that they want to talk about as, supposed to condemn LGBTQ people, so no, if you look at it, it's really God's concern about being, about justice and God's mandate to be concerned about the least of these in our society. And so we can't do that. We can't do the work of God. We can't live a life like Christ if we are not concerned about the least of these. And that has to include the LGBTQ plus community, who are constantly oppressed and marginalized on a daily basis.
I love that. I just wanted to say that before we pass it to Jacob or Aaron.
That. I love that as well. I think, when I reflect on some of my early memories, mid memories, I suppose, of church, after being a very young person, running around the churches and that I was in, and then started getting involved and with the work of the church. My primary church home, we housed homeless in our church, and that sort of work and working with one of the most formative pastors in my childhood, or my lifetime actually, Pam. She and I would go sit and talk with people that weren't necessarily our church members. They were people living in our church, and really being, stewards of that ministry, but also without expectation of receiving, what do I want to say? Without expectation that people believe us, right? And so that sort of, but then that juxtaposed with other parts of my upbringing where it was expected that you conform and that you believe in certain things in certain ways, and that not feeling very justice oriented, and kind of putting those things together and trying to figure that out, and then leaning much more into the service aspects of faith and that justice work, the being in community, being with people, building systems of support that don't rely on systems of control. And so, or try not to rely or use the systems control the best we can. So yeah, I that really resonates with me. Thanks for sharing that, Luther.
Yeah, so for me, growing up in social justice, I grew up American Baptist in Massachusetts, and very different from Southern Baptist. Very similar to Congregationalist and UCC. But it was interesting, the dynamic of social justice and worship within the church. I didn't really recognize it until later in life. But that being said, I also grew up part Catholic. My dad was Catholic, my mother was Protestant, American Baptist. And the whole social justice movement for me actually was through my parents and my mother's love for people and her drive to make things right in the world under this peaceful movement, if you will. But also within the church, thinking back and looking back to all of the aspects that my church was involved in social justice movement, the the walks for hunger that we did, the collaborations with other churches to do some serious intersectional work with the churches. And we're talking in the 70s and 80s, where there was this, it was the break within faith communities was not as strong as it is today. Fortunately, thank you. But the understanding that we had to work together for the glory of God. We had to work together because that's what Jesus called us to do. And we have to, excuse me, we have to go out to where the people are. Don't expect the people to come to us. And that's what we did. We went to where the people were. We went to the different churches. We went to the different temples. We went to experience God in different ways. And the work that I do now very much has been impacted by those experiences in my life. Interestingly enough, when I went away to college, my undergrad degree is in youth ministries. And when I went away to college, went to the Pentecostal churches, went to the evangelical churches. Sadly, that's where my God hates gay people aspect came from. And I went away with this thought of okay, well, the old saying, love the sinner, hate the sin. I don't know how many of us have heard that and have been turned away and turned off from God because of that one phrase that is not scriptural in any way, shape, or form. And so coming back around to, the full knowledge and understanding of who God is and the work that I continue to try to do because of what I learned from my mom, the passion that she had for people, the understanding of the love of God that she knew of through that social justice work, through the peace movement, brought me to the place that I am today. And because of that, the church that I go to, and am a part of, the UCC Congregational, which is very social justice driven, is why I am where I am, and the church that I go to, because God calls us to be social justice oriented. That's what Jesus was. That's what Jesus was. And that's what he is all about. He went to where he was needed. He never told, other than let the children come unto me, he always went to everybody. He went to when, the soldier came and said, hey, I need you. He went to the sea. He went to the different towns and cities. He didn't just sit and say, nope, everybody, you got to come to where I'm at. Granted, people did come, but it wasn't because he said that they had to. It was because they heard and they saw something in him. And I hope, that everybody in the community knows, for the most part, those that know me know that I'm a Christian and that I love God. And that if any point anybody wants to talk to me about that, I'm more than happy to, because my passion is people, because God's passion was people. And so you cannot, in my opinion, you can't have one without the other. You can, absolutely, but as Christians, if we are called, then we must go. And so we have to go to where the people are. We have to meet them where they're at. we have to serve them like Christ serves us.
That was really powerful, Jacob. And I think about, action, and I facilitate and have conversations around anti-racism and diversity management. And the key indicator that someone is doing anti-racist work is that there's action attached to it. So if you think about being in the world and like doing something, and this conversation is doing something technically. When you think about doing something, if you take rest, that's a radical act. So I'm gonna throw that out there in terms of my definition of rest is of action is pretty expansive. But I think about the conversations that I had with my mother and my father, and growing up in the Pentecostal church, my father is a minister, and he was in the Pentecostal church, and now he's ordained in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. He does a lot of, interfaith stuff still. He's invited to some of those spaces, but as far as practicing, there's a couple churches around him that he may attend, but he's kind of, an at-home scholar around it. And I've always appreciated the conversations that we've been able to have because I got real close to death about 3 years ago. I stopped counting at 20 in terms of people in my life that passed away. And my father and I started having conversations, and we had already started our, conversations about what diversity management work would look like. And something about that changes you, something about like being with people days or hours or months before they pass away or even take their lives. It changes you. And those conversations were very honest, very vulnerable, and very real about what I should have spent more time on, or what doesn't matter, ultimately. And I just started a few years ago hearing about what my father and my mother did in terms of the 60s and 70s. If you think about the civil rights movement, as it's at its height at the time, my dad was going and he was desegregating school. He was a part of the youth that were going into schools to desegregate. And he is very light skinned and, could be considered in some spaces, depending on the time of year, white passing. And then my grandmother was incredibly white passing. And then my mother is very dark skinned. And so she also was a part of desegregation. My father was born in Louisville. My mother was born in Kentucky, Cincinnati area. And, they just started telling me those stories of being like radical participants and activists. And I was just like, what didn't make it safe to tell me that this was happening for you? And I think about all the things, like I grew up, we were middle class. They had master's degrees. My mom has an honorary doctorate. I went to Montessori school as an elementary, and then I went to private schools, and I had the best opportunities for education. I was at Cincinnati Hills Christian Academy. So I was at an evangelical high school. Like they encouraged me to have experiences. We traveled. And it almost mirrors, like in the church, my dad wasn't allowed to be as radical as he may seem now, which I find him not as radical as maybe others do. But, my mother was like, definitely in service and things like that in the church. And, we've argued like about what Christ really meant, or like, what is this supposed to happen? Like, I don't believe that I have to be, fit into a tiny box in terms of how I show up to be appreciated and respected by God. Like I have a voice. You taught me to have opinions. You taught me to have that. And you taught me to show up. And when I think about Jesus and the most marginalized, and how Jesus like literally hung out with the most marginalized, and having dignity for everyone. And then also like having my parents kind of, we never really talked about a lot until now. And so like, they're kind of forced to talk about it because like, I'm like, oh, I'm trauma informed. They're like, we don't want to talk about it, but we're going to talk about it. And so they're into it. My dad's like in psychology. So when you think about those things, it's a reckoning of sorts, right? I feel like last year and the year before was kind of a reckoning for the world, but we started those conversations, and to hear that like in church, you can't be too radical. You can't do this. Like it was a mirror of society. And especially in the Black church, you weren't allowed to make too much noise. your church could get burned down. Like, let's just be real about it. And then, when you think about how you had to show up, a survival tactic was showing up polished, in line, not stepping out of line, staying in your lane, like all of those things, educated, having a name that was easily said, Karen, when you look at those type of things, my sister's name was Christina. My other sister's name was Kimberly. Like, when you look at those things and how I talk about this with my partner right now, but like, our parents taught us how to navigate white supremacy and dominant systems. And they didn't mention about how radical they were because it wasn't something they even thought was a big deal. Like, looking back, I'm like, do you realize how big this was that you were a part of this? That you were doing this work, and I'm doing it now. Like, and I get it honest, like, thanks. Like, I got it from both sides, but I get it honest. But do you realize how powerful and what your impact was and what your influence was? And I think the difference between the last civil rights movement and this movement is that people start to feel like they have permission, like they're allowed, like it's our birthright and our right to exist. And when we talk about the beloved community, when you look at Martin Luther King and even Malcolm X and his theories in religion, like, religion was a big part of that. Like, this is not what God wants. So whoever you agree with and whatever, theology or theories you believe in terms of racial justice and biblical practices, I think it's important to realize that what the message was at the end of the day was that we all have a birthright. We all deserve to exist, and we all deserve to live and not only survive, but thrive. And I think, for a long time, I thought with the Pentecostal church, I knew exactly what I wasn't supposed to do. I knew exactly what I was not allowed to do. And so, but when I think about, going into the United Methodist Church and being able to explore and question God and not just be told, like, you don't want to receive the wrath of God if you question God, but being able to have those conversations and build relationship with Christ and God and be able to ask those questions and get answers and not be smited. Like, that was nice. That was nice to be able to do those things and be in a space where it was like, I see you, I see your color, and I see your dignity too. And let's have that conversation, because God wanted us to be all able not to just survive and thrive. Like, I have to think God didn't just put some of us on this earth to just endure and then go to hell too, because whatever. So I just think that it's an ongoing conversation. It's a conversation that it makes sense if you're like not interested in the conversation because of all the harm and the trauma that it could place, just epigenetically from years and years and generations of being told something. So I think it's really important to have this conversation. And I also think it's important to keep digging up the stuff. When we talk about sifting, wheat from the tare, when we talk about those type of things, it's happening right now. And people are finally saying, well, faith is important. Spirituality is important. I need to center. I need to ground. There's divinity within me when I talk about my body being a temple. And I think it's important to know exactly what Jesus meant. So that gets challenging when we talk about the study of it. And people are like, the Bible may be made up and who wrote it. And when you start to getting into all of that, I almost went to MTSO in Ohio for seminary because they had a new racial justice degree. And I was like, But I think it's important to do all the study. And I also recognize that it's a ton of work to dig in and really uproot some of those things or create new wineskin, right? Because we keep sometimes trying to put old wine into that new wines, into that old wineskin, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work. So when we think about, and I want to be considerate of time, when we think about looking forward and what we want to create, I love, Reverend Young, your model that you had come into, but as we look into the future and the social justice work that is happening, and I know Jacob, you teach diversity and all that as well. So what does that look like in the future? What are little steps that you feel like you can do as an individual? And then as a community, what do you feel like the call to action is in terms of religion and social justice?
I think for me, we have to continue to expand what diversity looks like because we are so, I think, still in this model of diversity is just about black and white. And while we still need, I don't have to tell most of the folks on here that there's still a lot of work to do with regard to that. But we also have to understand the complexity of diversity and the beauty of diversity. Um, quick story, when I was in one of my classes, one of my students, after the first 2 days of classes, the second day, I had my students make up this box. On the outside of the box, they had to put pictures of what they think how other people see them. And then on the inside of the box is who they are, parts of who they are. So I had all my students share that, and then I shared my box. On the outside, I had a picture of the folks from Duck Dynasty, and some other aspects. And then on the inside, I had a trans flag, a cross, and a pick because I'm a musician. I play guitar and sing. And I had a student that day during class raise her hand and say, I have to apologize to you. Because when I walked into the class on the first day and saw you, I thought to myself, what does this old white man know about diversity? And I said, that's a good question. I says, and that's why we have to stop and start communicating with people, because we have to learn about the things that we have more in common with one another and the beauty of our diversity than we have that we're not alike. We have more in common with people than we realize, but we don't stop and think about that. The first thing we often do is we look at a person and think, okay, are they safe to talk to? Would they be somebody that I could connect with? Instead of looking at somebody saying, what can I learn from them? And that's how we have to look at social justice is, what can I learn from people? What can I learn from people that I don't have, that I think I don't have in common with? What can I learn and take to the table? Because Jesus wasn't just a teacher. I know he learned also from his disciples. Even though he knew everything, he was still human. And he still took the things, it says in the scripture that, he took all these things to his heart. And he heard what the people were saying. He heard what they needed. He saw their desire. He felt when people touched him. We have to be like Jesus in deciphering those things. We have to listen. We have to see. We have to be present when we are doing this work. And I'm not just saying physically present. I'm saying all consciously present. If we're not present and we're somewhere else, we are going to miss the present that someone is giving to us. And in social justice work, we have to incorporate Jesus into the work that we're doing. And diversity and inclusion and all of these nuanced words that we're hearing these days are nothing new to Christianity. But we have to go back to where Jesus was. We have to go to where we were called from when Jesus walked this earth, because we have lost that. And if we don't start incorporating that into the work that we're doing, I believe we are losing the message, and we are losing the people that need it the most. Folks within the LGBTQ plus community, they're hungry. They are hungry for acceptance. They're hungry for love. They're hungry to see themselves And so many people, especially within my trans, with my trans siblings, they don't see Jesus in them. And they have to, because we are a creation of the Creator. I was created exactly the way that I was supposed to be created. And God has given me the strength to get through everything that I have needed to get through. I am a precious, precious child of God. And when we do the social justice work, we help people see how precious they are. Whether we use Jesus's name or not, people can see it through us, and that's what we have to do. We have to be Jesus to people, whether they know it or not, whether we say it or not. And that way we are carrying on the work that needs to be continually done every single day. I hope I answered the question. I know I was kind of all over the place, but I'm pretty sure I did.
I love that. And I wanted to, yes, you did answer the question. Absolutely. When you talk about, just to reiterate the question, what does moving forward, religion, faith, your action, your social activism, your racial justice work, what does all of that look like ideally in terms of moving forward and how you operate in the community? I think that people knowing that, and sometimes it can just be a mind frame or a mindset in terms of how we operate. If I knew that early on, I don't know how that would have changed my expression. I have a theory operating that maybe someday I'll write some essays on, that Jesus is non-binary. It's my thought process. I like to think that Jesus is all things. So I'm working on that, Aaron. I'll hit you up. We'll work on that together. But if I had that mindset, and if I knew that, like, Jesus, that there wasn't something wrong with me, right? Or that God was in me, or God saw themselves in me, it would probably have helped me operate a lot, not in shame and guilt and the way that I did in the first 20 to 25 years of my life, for sure. So thank you for that, Jacob. Anyone else?
I just wanted to, absolutely, that's great. I love that idea as well, Karen. I think part of my call to action is really finding a new, refinding a voice within me that's been quiet for a long time. And also really kind of calling our fellow people of faith in and out and to the conversation. Stop hiding behind religion and the protection of church, for God's sakes. I mean, quite literally. Stop hiding and own our collective responsibility of the damage that religion causes. The awesome power of religion and faith to be a force for social justice or a destruction of people. Both are true. And so I don't want to focus on one over the other. And so I think for me, it's a both and the history of radical social justice and also the destruction and genocide of people and culture. And so I think with that and what we see politically today, even right now in Ohio, just yesterday, the Ohio Senate slipped an amendment into an appropriations bill called conscientious protections, something like that, which is basically you don't have to provide health care for anybody you disagree with. I work for a healthcare organization. I mean, it's asinine, the idea that we can use religion to say, I'm not going to serve you. It's contrary to everything that I believe my faith and spirituality to be. And so for people to use it as a weapon is not only offensive but dangerous. And so I think we can't be, I'm not saying we on this panel, but we as a group, as a faith, as multi-faith, intersectional faith, we can't be afraid of that conversation. And we have to lean into it. And that's my call to action personally. So yeah, that's how I see the social justice within my faith operating right now, is rising up and being a resistance to that. And other things, but that's heavy on my heart today.
I love the complexity of that, saying that either, like, not either, but this can exist and this exists, like which, it's almost like the which wolf do you feed analogy or metaphor, right? So like the one that'll grow is the one you feed. And so what are you doing and how are you using that to serve? So I love that. Reverend Young or Erica, do you have any thoughts on what that looks like ideally moving forward?
One of the things that I'll say is that any sort of justice work that is not intersectional is ineffective. At the very least, less effective, but largely in the end, ineffective. Shameless plug, I watched my TED talk on white supremacy and the interconnectedness of discrimination. I think it's a good talk, but it really is true that all of these things are interconnected and we can't disentangle them. And when we try to, our efforts fail or they are not as effective as they could be. And Karen mentioned earlier, our ancestors and many of our parents and other folks that we love were very much involved in the civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s. And those movements were pivotal, monumental. But I must say that those movements were probably not as effective as they could be because they were not as intersectional as they could be, right? Those movements did not give as much care and concern to queer and trans people, right? It was kind of well, we're gonna focus on this race thing right now, so you all kind of need to wait your turn while we kind of figure this out. And I get the mentality. It was a tactic, it was a strategy that they employed for that particular time period. However, I would argue that perhaps those movements would have gotten a little bit farther if they really lived and leaned into the concept of united we stand, divided we fall. We are much stronger together. Furthermore, I would say that you can't disentangle these things, right? Because they are all, in my view, and my argument is that they are all rooted in white supremacy. They all stem from the same root. They all do the same thing. It is to say that there are certain people who deserve care and attention, or certain people who are of more value than other groups, right? It's all the same thing. And so these things are all very much interconnected. And so I would always tell people, if you can't tell me that you believe Black Lives Matter if you don't believe trans lives matter. But that's a lie. You don't believe Black Lives Matter if you don't believe trans lives matter, right? You can't say that you're all for LGBTQ plus equality if you're not also concerned about folks who are disabled or differently abled, right? Like, we can't disentangle these things. They're all connected. And until we realize that, and until we all band together, right, and we'll attack all of these issues on all of these fronts simultaneously, we will not see the progress that we're looking for. So many of us are saying that we're ready for a revolution, or we're ready to dismantle, and we want these systems to fall. It's not going to happen until we do the hard work and we come together, because it is hard. It's hard to do all these things at one time. It's hard to acknowledge all of these things at once. I get that. That's why we all need to come together in order to get this work done. And when we do that, I believe that our movements will be an unstoppable force, and we will see some radical transformative change. But until then, I think we're going to kind of keep spinning our wheels and, getting a little bit of progress here and there, a few steps forward, several steps back. And we're kind of caught in this rubberneck traffic jam of trying to say we're making progress. But if we really want to go full steam ahead, we got to pull it all together.
Karen, I think I came back at right after you asked your question. So I want to, just for clarity, I want to make sure that I understand it. Could you repeat it for me?
Sure. So we only had one question after you left. So you had answered that last question, and then we talked about in the future, what does it look like for social justice, racial justice, and the work of religion, the church? How does that ideally look to you moving forward? What would you want to mention or consider or see created?
Earlier in the conversation, you talked about Jesus hanging out with, you know, some of the most downtrodden in community, and during his time. And I have a friend here in Cleveland that's a minister, and I often joke with him and say, I want to do ministry like Jesus did. You know, I want to be more of kind of that hippie, you know, with the tie dye on, and I just want to do good things for people and touch the hearts of any and all people wherever possible. And there's a part of me that feels like the pandemic has made religion, church, become a little more accessible. You know what I mean? Because of, you know, people have turned to Facebook and YouTube and other formats in order to minister. And I think that when we really come out of this pandemic, I think the church will look a lot different. And I think that that service to our communities will look a lot different. And hopefully my desire is that it will look a lot more like the work that Jesus did. You know, as you know, we've gone through this pandemic, there have been people who haven't, you know, didn't have the resources that they needed to survive, food and whatnot. So my hope and anticipation is that you know, kind of like what would Jesus do back in was the early 2000s or so, that will become more of a centralized focus of the church, and to do ministry like Jesus did, to focus on social justice like Jesus did.
Beautiful. I just think about centering Black voices, Indigenous voices, people of color, trans folks, trans women, Black trans women especially. And I'm just grateful for that insight, because if you listen to the answers, I think what you can see is that everybody's taken care of if we do it like we want it to be done. And I think people fear what they don't know, but in the minds of the most marginalized, we want to love and see everybody live and thrive, not get revenge, right? So when I think about that, it's a wonder that we keep going. So I do, as my last question, I think sometimes people come and look for tangible ways that they can walk away from here and practice. And what is taking care of yourself? What is creating boundaries? What does self-care personally look like for you? I'll answer it first. In my mind, it means I'm a big time organizer, so I have to get my calendar together. I literally will schedule meditation and prayer time. I will schedule creative time to write and do music or poetry. I schedule those things and block off those times. I also try to have 4 hours before I ever touch humans in a day. So it means I'm getting up pretty early to be with myself and be at peace, because it's pretty peaceful there. It also means that I, care for how I eat and how I navigate the world, and when I can go out and be, around energy that I will definitely take in. There are a lot of things. I like to walk a lot. I work out. Like I find it really supportive for me I'm not doing anything quickly. I used to be a college athlete. So there's lots of tendons that don't look the same way they did 20 years ago. So, I mean, I'm working out, but I'm just in my own space a lot compared to where I used to have to go. Like I need more time by myself and with God and in communion there. So what does it look like for you to practice your faith individually and collectively in a time that has really called us to go inward, I think, over the last 15 or so months, and in community? What does that look like for you?
I think for me, it's reconnecting with people, human beings, and in person. I've joked throughout my life, I'm so extroverted, I have to talk to think, which is pretty true. And I, when we moved into, quarantine, isolation, pandemic life, whatever we want to call it, I had no way really to fully grasp what damage that was going to do, just to my well-being. It's I still don't know, to be honest. It's been real hard. And so I've noticed in the past 2 weeks after returning to my office, after seeing people, the energy levels are starting to come back up, and it's great. So I think I'm focusing on that. I mean, yes, keeping myself organized and trying not to say yes to everything I possibly can right now, because that's going to cause a different issue, but with similar outcomes probably. But really just trying to reconnect on meaningful levels, I think, is my well-being right now. Yeah. So things like this, even though it's virtual, I think this level of conversation, or doing more things like this in person as it becomes safer, and finding safer ways to do those things, for everybody, regardless of whether or not we can have a vaccine or one-to-one or all of those things, which are all perfectly fine. We can figure out how to be in community safely. So yeah, that's what I'm focused on.
I love that.
I would say, specifically in terms of self-care, I encourage us to listen to our bodies. They often tell us lots of things and we don't listen. Our bodies tell us all the time, hey, we are tired. And, we don't listen, and we're like, no, we're not. We're going to keep working. No, we are tired. Ergo, we need to go sit down. And, it is okay to tell people that, hey, can you come do this? Hey, can you be a part of this? Hey, I'm looking, you know what? I can't, and, some people will, if it's more comfortable for you to come up with an excuse, that's fine. I've reached a point in my life where I don't have to give anybody any sort of explanations. Like, I'm not coming, I'm not doing it. That's that. So listening to our bodies, even in terms of participating in activities or relationships, right? Growing up Pentecostal, we would always say, the Holy Ghost give you discernment. And I believe that. And yeah, I don't like this. I've never been a fan of the spirit body dualism thing, that they're separate. I think that our spirits are embodied. And so that discernment will show up in your body, right? You will find yourself in situations or find yourself interacting with people and you feel something, right? Sometimes that's a good thing. You're like, oh my gosh, this is great. Like, I'm really loving this connection. This is incredibly life-giving. My soul and spirit is being nourished by this interaction, right? Whereas other times, you're in a situation or you're engaging with a person or a group of people and your body is like, there's all sorts of anxiety there. There's all sorts of unease. And so it's okay to listen to your body and say, you know what? Something's not right about this. This ain't agreeing with my spirit. Ergo, I need to remove my body from this particular situation. And so I would just encourage all of us, listen to our bodies. They speak to us all the time. Our bodies are a beautiful gift from God. So we should use them wisely and not abuse them and be nice to them, because otherwise they will knock us off our feet and on our behinds when we don't, and force us to listen to them.
It's a very loud Thursday message, but I receive it. I receive it for me personally. Thank you. Jacob or Erica?
Yeah, I think that giving ourselves permission, I think that's the hardest thing that we can do, is to give ourselves permission to take that time. Because especially those of us that have our hands in several cookie jars, it's hard, and for as long as I've been doing this work, self-care has not always been a number one priority for folks. It's just been over the past 5 years or so that we have really started to drive home the concept of self-care. And for me, self-care looks like, really getting into my connection with God. And, when I get into my car, my radio is set to the Christian music station because I need to be fed. I need to be fed every single time. Over the pandemic, probably the past almost 2 years now, I've been constantly reading, which has never been something that has, I've never really had that drive to read. But there have been some things going on in my personal life that have kind of shook me. And so, picking up books that have given me life, that have, reminded me of the scriptures and reminded me that God is always with me, that he's never going to leave me, that there are promises in that wonderful book that we can rely on, that we often forget about. And when we can go back to those and keep reiterating them within ourselves, that he's always promised to be with us. He's always promised to take care of us. If he takes care of the birds in the air and the flowers, then he is going to take care of his children. One of the sayings that I say a lot to folks, that, my father owns cattle on 1,000 hills, so I don't have to worry about things. And people are like, what do you mean? Well, back in the day of the scripture, cattle was wealth. And my Father God has anything and everything that we could ever need to make sure that we are taken care of. But we have to rely on him. We have to go back and say, okay, Lord, give me, fill my cup, because it's half empty. Relight that fire underneath me and give me that rest, where it talks about he lays me beside still waters. We need those still waters. And if we can't be refurbished, then we are just going to forget sometimes to bring him to the forefront. And when we don't bring him when I don't bring him to the forefront, I can easily not think about him. And for me, for the work that I do, I have to think about him, because like I said, my passion is the people, and God's passion is people. And I can't serve them if I can't serve myself, and if that's where God has called me, God will, fill me. God will give me what I need so that I can continue to give to them. But I can't get what I need if I don't call on him and ask for it. And so I'm trying to remind myself every single day of that. And like I said, often it's when I'm in the car and I am listening to the music and I am thinking about him and getting filled for the day, because I'm an introvert extrovert. Most people look at me and they're like, oh, well, you're an extrovert, you're always here and you're always talking to people, blah 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 blah. And I'm like, oh, but my gosh, you don't know what I have to do when I get home to decompress, because that's way too much sometimes. I love people, I want to be around people, and sometimes I can't. This, like Aaron said, this pandemic has been like, oh my gosh, I need to be around people. But on the other hand, sometimes people are too much, and so I need help to decompress, and God just gives me that rest that I need. But I have to continue to give it over to him. I have to continue to, say, okay, Lord, you need to do the work, because right now I can't do it. So I'm going to let you do it. And, like it says, he works for good. Whatever we can do for him, he will make everything good in his timing. So
Self-care. I've learned over the course of the last, really probably in the last 2 years, but I've been really involved in activism in the community for some time. And maybe a year and a half ago, my body started to tell me, it's time for a break. And I didn't listen for about 6 months. But then when the pandemic hit, it was like, oh, okay, well, maybe God sent me this pandemic because I needed to rest. And the reality is, he didn't just send it for me. There's a part of me that believes that we all needed to rest, and he wanted us all to slow down and sit down. And so I pulled back on some things that I was involved in to refresh. My body was literally, I'm diabetic, so my body was literally kind of just breaking down in different ways. Um, and at the beginning of this pandemic last year, I probably could only get on my bicycle. I cycle maybe a couple of miles. And last night I did 20 with a group. And a couple of days ago, my pastor saw a picture that I had posted on Facebook, and she was like, you really look vibrant and refreshed," and and I did, and I felt that way, partly because I had taken some time away. You know, I will probably re-engage, as we come out of this pandemic. But I think that it's important, as someone said, I mean, maybe a couple of people have said, I know that Luther mentioned just listening to your body, but also listen to your mind. Your mind sometimes will tell you, it's time to sit down and just sit and get that rest that you need and make that connection with God, and meditate and heal and and then you can go about doing the things that you were doing. And as Karen mentioned, laying out a calendar. I used to just kind of do things off the cuff. If somebody wanted me to do something, sure, I'm there, I'm there. Now, I plan time in my week for me. My office hours are, from blank to blank. This is when I this is when I do, activism work. Someone had done that to me, or mentioned that to me several months ago. They were trying to organize something, and they were like, well, I only do activism work, at these times. And I thought that was really odd. But, at the end of the day, I'm like, Okay, I can respect that. You know, you putting time periods on when your availability, and this is when you're willing to do the work. So, um, you know, we have to all take time for ourselves, and that's important, and kind of move from there and refresh and revive and rejuvenate ourselves. And I feel good. So that's what self care looks like for me.
I think that is a perfect segue to end this. Thank you all for sharing really vulnerably and being here to have a conversation that is often not had. I know it may take you to a lot of different places emotionally. I'm not sure. So thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing vulnerably. I'm going to pass it back to Eric. Thank you, Eric, for having us all together and organizing all of this. This was really, really beautiful. So.
Hi. A point that seems to be at the top of my head is that when I decided I wanted to organize this, I didn't go to church or synagogue or temple or mosque. I went to, I didn't look for somebody who had aced a course in sociology of religion. I looked for an instructor or a professor from the sociology department, and it turns out he's ordained, and he is the national leader of a national denominational LGBTQ group. I, again, didn't go to church. I went to the board of TransOhio, and I found two people associated with it, both of whom have master's degrees, both of whom have done really amazing things with TransSaints, trans and queer people of color, Margie's Hope, Margie's store or closet, I forget. And just amazing. I found the executive director and the deputy director of stellar organizations in our community. I went to find our community's leadership, and what I got out of the conversation was something that filled my heart, filled my soul. You fed me today. I really hope that all of you will come back and do it again. I think there's some things we can do with marketing and publicity. I know there's several people who said they couldn't do it Thursday morning at 10:30. They were looking for evenings or Saturdays. So I will come back to you, and I hope that all of you, let me be really frank, especially Erica. It was so important when I was doing this. I wanted a Black trans woman, and I found a Black trans leader. It was so important that you all were involved. And Eric, I'm really saying that to you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for the insights. Thank you for the spiritual depth that you brought to an event that I thought was going to be like an activist event. Thank you so much for that. God be with you until we meet again. And thank you. Bye.